Thank you for joining us at the Stanfords Travel Writers Festival. Author and GP Gavin Francis talks to Julia Wheeler now about his new book, Island Dreams.
Hello, and let me add my welcome to the Stanfords Travel Writers Festival, and in particular to this event. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining in. And today, thank you for coming to some rather far away places in the company of Gavin Francis, who has written this beautiful book, Island Dreams. I mean, the writing is lyrical. The design you must be delighted with. And the maps you just want to linger over. So huge congratulations, first of all, on the book, Gavin.
No, thank you very much for that introduction, Julia. That was, yeah, I'm very, very happy with the book. Beautifully produced, thanks to Canongate.
Yeah. It's not, I'm not stepping out of line by saying that you have an obsession with islands, am I?
No, I don't think that's inaccurate. As you know, you see on the subtitle of the book, Mapping an Obsession, it was an attempt really for me to understand this recurrent pull back and forward to places of isolation and back into the centres of cities that has pulled me almost in a curve back and forward all my life. And I wanted to understand where that came from and whether there was ever any hope of resolution. I wanted to explore, you know, why is it that we still, as a culture, are obsessed with islands? You know, why are we still reading Robinson Crusoe after 300 years? Why do we have Desert Island Discs, Love Island, all the rest of it? And so it was a kind of twinned exploration of those cultural obsessions with islands, along with my own wandering pattern between places of isolation and connection all over the world.
So we'll come on to that bigger picture and the sort of cultural side of things later, but let's come to you. Where did you discover, or where did you sort of look back inside yourself and see where this began?
Well, there's a couple of there's lots of different tributaries, I guess, to this river, which has animated my life. One would be definitely the gigantic world atlas in the local library when I was a little boy, that I used to sit and look at and explore archipelagos of islands all over the world and wonder if I would ever have the chance to visit any of them. I loved that kind of vicarious atlas travel, as I'm sure many of the audience do as well, you know. So that's one of the tributaries, I guess. The other is when I was small, I also used to regularly have my holidays along the east coast of Fife. And there were camping holidays, and as I would drift off to sleep, there was always the lighthouse on the Isle of May off the coast. I would watch the lighthouse and hope one day to go out there. It seemed to me, you know, that it was part of Scotland, part of the same shoreline, but also a place apart, a place separated. I knew there was no permanent inhabitants on it anymore, and that it had become a bird reserve, and that isolation and what happens when we leave a little bit of land alone really fascinated me.
And you went there later and became a warden, didn't you, for a month?
Yeah, that's right. Just as a volunteer, I was at the time I was working a very hectic job as a trainee neurosurgeon in Edinburgh. It was a very difficult job, lots of sleepless nights and exhaustion. And when I was getting towards the end of that rotation at work, I started to fantasize again about the Isle of May. Thought, wouldn't it be wonderful just to be surrounded not by people but by birds? And so I wrote off to Scottish Natural Heritage and said I was available and prepared to do any kind of skivvy work they needed on the island, and off I went. So yeah, that was a great dream come true.
And it's got 3 lighthouses there, I believe, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. There's one of the oldest lighthouses in Northern Europe, which is from the 1600s. Which has now been, it's ruined now. The Victorians ruined it in order to stop it from blocking the light of their lighthouse. There's a famous Stevenson lighthouse from the 1800s, which is still going, and that's the one that's been automated now. And then there's a third lighthouse called the Lowlight, which was built so that mariners could line up its light with the Stevenson lighthouse in order to avoid some rocks. But now, of course, with radar and sonar and all the rest of it, they don't need it. So they don't actually use that lighthouse anymore, which is a pity. But it means that you can if you are a bird ringer and if you're a committed naturalist, you can apply. I think years in advance you have to go and live on that island and take part in the bird surveys that go on. They live in that lighthouse. I'm sorry.
There's a wonderful circularity to that story about the Isle of May, which really spoke to me, I guess, in that you talk about taking your children back there and how they enjoyed it. But also there's that element, isn't there, of our love of islands, or our sort of romanticism of islands being something about things that we experience in childhood, the beaches.
Yeah, most of the beaches. No, I talk in the book about a friend of mine who, during the difficult toddler years that many parents struggle through, trying to keep the kids entertained at certain phases, and a friend of mine saying, just take the kids to the beach. That way they entertain themselves. And asking my own kids, who also love islands, what they love about them. And they say, oh, they have beaches all around, they've got space to play, trees to climb, and that they feel safe. And in a way, those are sort of distillations of the reasons that grown-ups love islands as well, really. And I should point out, I suppose, at the moment that we're talking very much about the outsider's view. And one thing that I wanted to get across in the book is the difference between an outsider, often like myself, who would go from the city to an island for a while, versus an island community, which has a completely different perspective on the place. And I've worked as a GP in small island communities and know that there's a paradox at heart there, that sometimes small isolated communities are more interdependent, and it's far easier to become lonely in the city than it is on an island. And that's another one of these tensions that I wanted to explore through the book.
So you were in Orkney as a GP, weren't you? And I thought it was very interesting that even though people might think of Orkney as, we'll come on to the word remote and the differences, whether that needs to be in quote marks in a second, but people already think of that as an island. But actually, when you were there, you found that wasn't distant enough and used to have to take yourself off to Hoy.
Well, I suppose it's, at that point, I was working as a GP. A GP's job is, of course, all about meeting people and talking all day, every day. And that's what I love about the job, that you feel your way through words to the release of somebody else's distress, really. And so when I was a GP on the mainland of Orkney, I would find myself talk, and getting to know all the people in the small community. And I realized that part of myself that loves isolation, it would need to go to yet another smaller island. And it's a sequence that I think is beautifully described there's a very strange short story by D.H. Lawrence called The Man Who Loved Islands, that I'm sure some of the audience know of. It's a very strange story, and where it describes a rich man who buys an island, and it becomes not small or remote enough. So he moves to another island, and that one is not small enough or remote enough. And he eventually ends up abandoning his family and moving to some tiny place, like Rockall off the west coast. And I thought Lawrence skewered really well how that love of isolation, if we're not careful, it can really quickly slide into misanthropy and a kind of angry belligerence at the rest of the world, trying to push onto your life. And I didn't want that either. I love people, it's why I'm a doctor. I love being around people. I love the possibility of connections, but there is still something really valuable about getting away from the intensity of human connection in the city. And that's exactly that tension that I've spent the book trying to explore, not just in islands in Scotland, but all around the world. Yeah.
You say in the book that actually that tension, you were perhaps aware of it, but you didn't need to resolve it until later on in your life, when you've got family and connections. Do you feel you're at some balance with that now that you've made this exploration and written about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to a certain extent I have found a balance that I'm happy with for this phase of my life. as you pointed out, you don't need to find a balance so much if it's just you. Or when it was just my wife and I, it was a lot easier. We could spend a few months in the city, and then we would go off traveling, and we would go to different places, remote places. And then when you have kids that need school, and you need to start to think about where you most belong, it's a very difficult decision for somebody who's been so peripatetic like myself. Really hard, because I love so many places, and what I love is about moving between them, as I'm sure the audience of the Stanford Travel Festival all feel the same way as me. And when you've got to choose somewhere, it's not easy at all. But now I live outside Edinburgh. I don't live in the centre of it anymore. And I find myself going off to Orkney a couple of times a year to do locums on some of the smaller islands, just to work for a week or so. I like all the travel that I used to be able to do for my books before COVID, the catastrophe of COVID happened. And so I find a balance that way, I think, through occasional locums using my medical work, and through traveling to talk about my books.
We're going to come away to some of those far off places that you've travelled to in a second. But let me just ask you, first of all, about this idea of remoteness, because it's a sort of moot point, isn't it? That, an island, say somewhere in the Orkneys, is remote, but that does rather raise the issue of a sort of arrogant, urban, metropolitan attitude. Is that something that you've also struggled with and thought through?
Well, very much. I don't use the word remote in the book to describe these places, because it begs the question: remote from what? The writer Malachy Talak, who's a Shetlander, we were chatting about this one day, and he says, when I'm on Faroe Islands, London feels remote. And that's very, very true. It's such a relative term. It's not really a very useful word. It's kind of like the word wild, in that we think we know what it means until we start to look into it. But on the other hand, if we want to start specifying terms, things are remote. So I would say, to somebody who would say that Faroe Islands isn't remote, I would say, well, you're absolutely right. But then perhaps it is remote from things like hospital medicine, if you got really sick, or it's remote from the ease of access when the weather's very bad, things like that. So it's all relative, really, and that's why I try and steer away from the use of the word. And it feeds back into that tension we mentioned earlier, doesn't it? The tension that the tension and the paradox that sometimes small communities are far more interconnected, and you feel yourself very enmeshed within a community, much more when you're in a place which is often considered far-flung than when you're living in the centre of a city, where it's quite possible to live in a stairwell where you know none of your neighbours, for example. And there's a passage in the book when I move with my family, we move into the centre of the city, and we discuss the kind of the strange changes and adjustments that forces upon the family, and on the children, who start becoming more bewildered about not knowing the neighbours and so on. And when space to play becomes such a busy kind of communal park, that changes the way they interact with their own environment. That's all part of the tension that I hope to work out through the pages of the book. And you can tell me whether you think I've been successful.
No, I think it absolutely is. And the whole idea of islands is just so rich with metaphor, isn't it? The family as an island, for example. We're all islands at the moment, let's face it. In the current situation, it certainly feels like that. So take us to Antarctica. I am positing that actually your time there sort of brings together both your medical training and allows you to use it, but also your love of this isolation.
Yeah, absolutely. I was initially, when I qualified in medicine, I was an emergency medicine doctor, and then I heard about the possibility of these roles as being a doctor to a remote research station. I'd already hitchhiked and camped across much of the European Arctic, and had started writing my first book about the European Arctic, True North. And I applied for this job as a base doctor at Halley Research Station, which is a few hundred miles from the South Pole on the Brunt Ice Shelf. And it was the most wonderful experience for somebody like me who enjoys not just traveling to remote places. There's that word again. Antarctica truly is remote. There's no arguing with that. But also, medically, professionally, it was wonderful. I went to Plymouth for 6 months to the Naval Hospital to be trained in lots of different kinds of skills that I would need to be able to do, such as develop my own x-rays and give general anesthetics and so on. And then sailed south as the ship's doctor on a research ship. And that 14 months that I spent as the base doctor in Antarctica was the first time in my professional life that I'd actually had time to stop and think. And that's the real gift of coming from the outside to a small, isolated place like that. The gift is time, really. The time that I spent there was just to think, to spend a lot of time skiing, to learn about all the other different people's roles on the base. And that was where I started writing. I finished my first book down there, the one about the Arctic. And yeah, it was the most extreme manifestation of my ilophilia, if you like, but it was also a great grounding to actually have the space and time to realize that I loved writing and that writing books was something that I wanted to continue to pursue, and it gave me a great deal of pleasure.
You also, while you were there, read a lot about the effects of isolation and things like how things such as how brain waves can change and actually how women cope better in isolation. Tell us about those.
Yeah, there's some really interesting psychology studies, because the Americans in particular and the Russians have done a lot of research on the effect of long-term isolation in Antarctica as part of their preparations for space programs. And there's a whole body of research into something called isolated and confined environments, by which they mean places like the International Space Station, saturation divers having to live in these little pods at high pressure under the sea, oil rigs, lighthouses, these kinds of things. And what they found, this body of research, is that a lot of the individuals who voluntarily choose to go to these places are quite calm people by nature, but that the experience makes them calmer, which is very interesting. And also that it seemed to almost be like a stress inoculation. So when they went and followed up a whole load of American Antarctic winterers 10, 20, 30 years after their experience, they found that they had better health outcomes than controls. And it seemed to be something, the psychologists proposed that it seemed to be something almost like an inoculation, a stress inoculation, that if you got through that, then the rest of your life felt a little bit more as if you'd been armed by the experience to be able to get through other difficult experiences. And while I was there was an ongoing study looking at the selection of Antarctic personnel, where there was a blinded questionnaire study, and then there was a debrief interview to find out how well people had coped afterwards. And they found that women coped better with the pressures of Antarctic living, but also, interesting, this was in the early 2000s. Women were less likely to be selected at interview. So it's a fascinating study because nobody had really done it before. Nobody had really used questionnaires in that way, sort of assessment questionnaires, as a blinded study before. The Russians, the Americans all had a form of a selection process that they used, but because the British didn't have an orthodox system, it was possible to do a trial on it and to compare blinded what would have happened if they had used some kind of selection questionnaires.
Let's stay with the medical side for a little, if we may, the sort of mental health side. I was also really interested in your talks with, I believe, psychoanalysts, about teenage isolation and actually how important it might be for teenagers to go and shut their bedroom door and be isolated.
Yeah. This was the part of the book that explores the writings, wonderful writings of a psychoanalyst called Donald Winnicott, who was a pediatrician in the 50s and 60s. He used to have a program on the BBC where he talked about good parenting. He's the origin of the idea of good enough parenting, that people had to stop being obsessed with being perfect parents and realize that it was about loving your children and being good enough. And Winnicott had some wonderful things to say about adolescence and how when we're adolescent, we are essentially, we have to separate ourselves from our parents. We have to take elements of our childhood selves and form them and harden them into our adult identities. And he thought that adolescents all need an element of isolation in order to accomplish that. And if you force shared group activities on them all the time, or force them to be with their parents or even with their therapists all the time, then that was counterproductive. You made a really interesting distinction as well between isolation, which was of use and helpful in the development of the personality, and insulation, which was detrimental and dangerous. And I've spoken to a couple of different psychoanalysts about this distinction, and it's a fascinating one. You know, the idea that a little bit of isolation is helpful and healthy for us, and it's something that we all need, versus the idea that once you cut yourself off completely from the outside world, then that's a pathological state, and that becomes something really unhelpful and even dangerous, which feeds back into my own explorations of why it is that the dream of island isolation, from desert islanders to Robinson Crusoe, is so prevalent across the whole of our culture. It's almost as if people recognize that we all need a little bit of space and silence and isolation in order to maintain that level of mental health.
The whole desert island disc thing and the Robinson Crusoe and the culture and so on, it's really about, isn't it, how would I cope? Would I be up to the job?
Yeah, there's a lot of it in that, yes. That whenever anybody gets back from a difficult experience and people say, what was it like? And that's the real question behind their demand, is they want to understand whether they would have. When I got back from Antarctica, that was a regular question that people asked me. Good friends, family said, what was it like? And they were putting themselves in that place in their own mind's eye. And yeah, I think that's a lot of the function of desert island discs as well, is when you distill your personality down to its absolute essentials, what would you take with you? And people like to think about that. I remember years ago reading the stories, the books, the brilliant books that Brian Keenan and John McCarthy wrote after their incarceration in Lebanon. You know, they were each sort of chained together in a series of dungeons for years and years. And it was so interesting how, to me, when they talked about their re-entry to society from that terrible experience, you know, totally incomparable experience to any of the isolations that I'm discussing. But it was illuminating on this particular topic of when they got back. That was the thing that was so dominating all the questions they were asked. Everybody wanted to wonder, how did you cope with that? And really they wanted to know was whether they would have coped with that. Would they have been able to survive such a grueling, awful period of isolation? I thought it was so valuable, and the different ways in which Keenan and McCarthy were sort of welcomed back was interesting too. They were welcomed back in very different ways.
Let's talk about sea life and bird life and wildlife generally, and perhaps that trip down to Antarctica is the way to do that. That journey, the Falkland Islands, for example, was within that itinerary, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, it's wonderful when you get the opportunity to sail like the length of the Atlantic, and you see as you sail through the tropics, there's very little in the way of life. You know, the odd bird, sometimes flying fish, but not very much. And then the closer you get down to the Falklands and down into the 50s of latitude, and suddenly the seas start heaving with life. You see whales, you get trailed by albatrosses, you see dolphins, and so on. And so one of the really glorious things about sailing to the Antarctic is seeing that a place that's often considered so devoid of life is actually the reverse. That's not true at all. The cold seas hold more oxygen, and that oxygen means that the beaches of these islands, like South Georgia or Bird Island that I talk about, with the albatrosses, down to the South Orkney Islands, which I also visited, with their elephant seals. And these places are completely heaving with life, thrumming with it.
The Falkland Islands, I think, is a kind of classic example of, for Britain, obviously, an island that is important within our psyche. It's just there. And I wonder what your thoughts about island identity, both with something like, like the Falklands and the history that we have with the Falklands, but also Britain as an island.
Yeah, I suppose when I was thinking about the Falkland Islands was a place which was, it almost has two identities, really. There's the ancient idea of the undisturbed bird life of the Falkland Islands. I hiked out to beaches where there were gentoo penguin rookeries, which had layers of guano suggesting millions of years of continuous occupation. These are places where the same penguins have been coming back for literally millions of years. So there's this idea that it was utterly timeless, that Europe felt so distant. And then there's the other Falkland Islands, which is, the pubs in Stanley with the gilt-framed photographs of Mrs. Thatcher, and the fact that at that time about half the population of the Falkland Islands was at the military base, Mount Pleasant. So it felt, there was an odd kind of cognitive dissonance going on, this place which was so ancient and so timeless, and then there was this sort of historical aspect to it, which was clearly so important, which was why I was there, as a representative of the British Antarctic Survey. The island, Britain as an island, we're kind of not an island anymore because we've got the Channel Tunnel, but we're still, I suppose what I'm really interested in exploring in this place. Of course, Britain is an island, but from that point of view, so is Greenland. And I was interested in exploring less that culture of an islander mentality that we could talk about with, for example, Brexit, or whether we're talking about a small island where people feel as if they've got away from it all. And when you're in Britain, you certainly are not feeling as if you've gone to a small island where you've got away from it all.
I wonder about the stories that go with that island mentality, though, and the things that we think, the stories that we tell ourselves, about the Armada or about plucky little Britain and all. Do you think that comes partly from being an island, or actually is that again another story that we just tell ourselves?
No, I think undoubtedly, the reason the British Empire happened was because of their mastery of the sea, and the British mastery of the sea happened because they were an island. Just as before the British Empire came along, the Dutch were the big empire that had mastery of the sea before, and now you would argue that the Americans are the ones that have the mastery of the sea. The Americans have got aircraft carriers in every ocean on Earth, and they are the ones who control the sea shipping. So you could argue that whoever controls the seas is the one who is the preeminent imperial power, and Britain went through that for a couple of centuries. Not so much now, although it's fascinating, isn't it, in the negotiations about Brexit, the huge significance of the fishing came to dominate, really came to dominate a lot of the final days of negotiation, considering it's a relatively small part of the economy, but people obviously feel it symbolically hugely important.
I think in years to come we'll read about the the balance there, won't we? It's probably it'll be an official secret for 30 years, almost certainly. Let's talk about islands within writing and literature and so on. The Odyssey, you talk about islands there being sort of testing grounds as that journey progresses and as the story is told. I wonder, have you felt, and if so, in which situations have you felt that islands have particularly tested you in one way or another?
Yeah, I was really interested in that idea. You know, some scholars believe that the Odyssey, the different islands encountered in the Odyssey, are rehearsed as part of a kind of mnemonic technique for the poet to be able to recite these island after island after island. And I realized that with this book, what I was doing is I was casting my mind back across 30 years of islands, remembering different phases of my life, times of challenge, times when I changed direction, pivoted in one way or another, and almost the book became that kind of mnemonic for me to remember that pathway through different kinds of islands over time. Books are, you know, books themselves are a kind of island, aren't they? You know, once you start reading, you feel as if you've got almost walls have come up around you, and you've become isolated yourself in the world of the author, the world that you create together. Author and reader join together and make something special and new. You know, every author-reader relationship is different, isn't it? And so I suppose here's some examples. Certainly when I was in Antarctica, that was a time, an extraordinarily testing time in all sorts of ways, and a time from which I emerged changed. And, you know, after that, I made a shift. I didn't want to work in hospitals anymore, and I moved towards working in general practice because I wanted to be more based in the community. I wanted to be more of a generalist. I wanted to have that kind of freedom and autonomy that comes from being your own boss rather than working in a hospital. So that was a big shift. Times when I went off and worked on the Isle of May, that was a wonderful sort of rediscovery of my self-resilience, and that I didn't need to be a doctor, that I could do other kinds of things as well. I could reassure myself, and that love of the natural world and ornithology that had sustained me so much as a child could still be a big part of my life. When I went to Orkney and rediscovered that kind of medicine when there isn't a big hospital on the horizon, and you have to be a little bit more self-reliant about the way that you practice medicine. That was an interesting phase. So yeah, I think you're right. The book does explore lots of different times and purposes of islands in my own journey. You know, one of the island groups that I talk about is the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean, and when I went there to the Andaman Islands, I'd been traveling. I'd done a long journey by motorcycle with my wife, and we'd left Orkney, and we'd driven to India by motorbike, and we were on our way to New Zealand. So it was a really long journey. It took a year and a half to do the whole thing. And I had this kind of break halfway through where I stopped in the Andaman Islands. And I went to this tiny island in the archipelago, and there was hardly anybody there, but the people that were there sharing the beach with me were Israeli soldiers who'd just been demobbed. And I had the most amazing conversations with these a guy and a girl about their time in the military, about what they wanted for their future, and the being on the island was itself the facilitator of these extraordinary conversations between me and them about what possible directions all of us might go in our lives from here on in. And I think that's a real power that these places have.
Yeah, it's almost a sort of healing power. And you talk about an island, or actually a peninsula, that you go to in Greece. When and very openly you talk about getting over a love affair, and actually how that landscape and being in that place really helped you.
Yeah, so I'd always wanted to go to the Athos Peninsula. You know, I'm a great lover of travel books. I love the books of Bruce Chatwin. I love the books of Patrick Fermor. I love the books of Robert Byron. All these writers have talked about Athos. And a phase in my life when I was feeling very low. As you say, I was kind of recovering, if you like, from a broken heart, and that I was allocated some holiday. I was given this time from a busy hospital job, and I couldn't change it. So I couldn't change my holiday allocation so that I could go with friends. I just had this random fortnight off in the middle of the winter. And so I'd always wanted to go to Athos, so off I went. And it was the most extraordinary experience for me, to be able to go to a place that had almost nothing of modernity, or very little of modernity in it, and to be welcomed, because the monks there have got taken this vow of hospitality, which you have to approach that hospitality in a respectful way, which I hope I did. And then being able to hike around the peninsula, monastery by monastery, through these, along these paths and through the woods around the mountain. For me, when I left Scotland, I was very agitated in my mind. And when I got back, I was no longer agitated. And it was the power of that experience, really, that gave me the space and the peace to let my mind settle. Yeah. So I hope I've done the good old monks of Athos justice. I had some great conversations with some of them, which I recount in the book, who've made the most, to us in a Western capitalist consumerist society, they've made a decision that seems quite odd from the outside, to go and give themselves up to obedience of the abbot of their monastery, and to give up all the luxuries and comforts that we think of in our society. And yet some of them would say to me that, I met one in particular who said, I've chosen the easy way to live because I have far fewer choices and I have time to think and pray and be at peace. Whereas you in a European city have chosen a very difficult way to live, constantly surrounded by distractions and forces that are pulling you in all directions. And I thought that was wonderful, the way he just flipped it around and said, my life isn't difficult, my life's easy. Yeah.
And it is that simplicity, isn't it, that the island potentially gives you, or is perceived to give you, which makes it, just makes us want to go there and to experience that. But equally, I'm thinking that you weren't tempted to stay. For a lot of it for you is about the choice to be able to come back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's a line in the book where I say that, the capacity for tolerating certain kinds of isolation is the ability to leave it behind when you need to. I remember another island I talk about is one in a nature reserve in Africa, in East Africa. And the warden of that nature reserve was desperate to leave and asked me about how he could find, if I could sponsor him to get out somehow. And it's true that the capacity to leave a place of deep isolation is very important for me to the mental peace of mind that you can get there. Otherwise you're trapped. And then we're into the whole long history of islands as prisons, from Alcatraz to Robben Island to the Bass Rock in Scotland and so on. So many islands have been prisons.
Gavin, it's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for taking us on this journey. We've been all around the world with you today. It's really very much appreciated. The book, as I say, is glorious. It's difficult to define because you can dip in, dip out. It's part memoir, it's part travel, but it's all, as I say, glorious. So thank you so much for being here. Thanks to everybody for watching. The book Island Dreams is available in Stanford's website. Do please go there and buy it. I would commend it to you most highly. Gavin, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you, Julia. That was a pleasure. And yeah, I hope you get traveling to your own island soon enough once we're all out of this lockdown Mark III.
No less than Bill Bryson said of Gavin, a wonderful writer, thoughtful, engaging, immensely knowledgeable and supremely human. Well, I think we can all testify to that. Thank you, Gavin and Julia, for that event. Well, travelling to islands is indeed the stuff of dreams. So, if, like the monks worried, you find yourself being pulled in all directions, then seal yourself off from it all and go island hopping with Gavin's book. Island Dreams is available to buy now at stanfords.co.uk.